So my wider research, I think in its broadest terms, is interested in the regulation of armed violence in the international system. So in another way of thinking of that is I've really been curious for a long time about how human communities have developed kind of imperfect, incomplete, but often quite meaningful restraints on how we harm one another. And it kind of sounds like a morbid topic. It's often not very happy subject matter, but it does offer sometimes opportunities to think about progress in global politics. And to me, that has been difficult, but also inspiring. Broadly, then, that has come in a couple of forms. I've been interested in the first part of my research was a lot around questions of how we could regulate conventional weapons like anti-personnel landmines. So I focused a lot of my early research in my PhD and first book on the prohibition on anti-personnel mines. And the other part of that really came to be focused on the emergence and consolidation of international criminal accountability for mass atrocity crimes in the International Criminal Court. And that was really the focus of my doctoral dissertation. My first book and early articles was those two parts, the conventional weapons and the ICC. Over the last few years, I've become really interested in outer space, and particularly the uses of outer space to enable various security practices on Earth, so using Earth orbiting satellites, but then also, and this is the area of my main research right now, the possibility of developing new norms, new legal rules to regulate those kinds of activities, but more especially the military uses of space and the possibility of space warfighting. So I'm working on projects right now with colleagues that are looking at trying to imagine the possibility for new restraints on the possibility of future warfighting in space, which hasn't occurred yet, but might be developing. So in the broader sense, going back to my undergraduate degree, I was really fortunate that where I studied at the University of British Columbia, we had a lot of opportunity to kind of explore different areas. And so the first couple of years of my undergraduate degree, I studied all sorts of things: philosophy, history, politics. And then around the middle of my degree, around the third year, I took a couple of courses on international security and politics of international law. And those just kind of caught my attention and became really a focus that has endured all the way up to the present day. This was in the late 1990s, and so it felt like a period of time as a student where on the one hand there was great optimism around the post-Cold War period, the possibilities for new forms of international cooperation. This is when the landmines ban and the ICC emerged. But that was coupled with this recognition of these emerging and really growing, accelerating humanitarian catastrophes, civil wars around the world. And so I kind of saw there's kind of this possibility of being engaged on humanitarian issues and thinking about the prospects for maybe even modestly improving those situations. And that carried through all the way to my PhD, where I went back to the University of British Columbia. I had a mentor and supervisor, Richard Price, who was working in these areas, and he had suggested the idea, the possibility of thinking through a dissertation that studied the emergence of these topics from the vantage point of instances where norms were built or developed in the face of great power resistance, as indeed was the case with the landmine ban and the ICC. China, Russia, the United States, and others had opposed those initiatives. So my dissertation kind of consolidated around the question of, could those norm-building, law-building exercises without great powers succeed, and what would that mean? And then that became the focus of the dissertation, my first book, and her early articles. Space stuff became an interest of mine later, just before the pandemic, and I was sort of thinking about new ways of things I'd like to study. And through conversations with colleagues, with other scholars, it occurred to me that this might be an area that was somewhat understudied, and I took a bit of a whim and applied for some funding and very generously received a grant from the Leverhulme Foundation, which gave me a year away from my regular work to think and write, and that coincided with the sort of early phase of the pandemic and a time when there was opportunities to think and write because we weren't doing other things, and that's been the genesis of the work I'm doing now. I'm really fortunate to actually have been one of the two founders of the CGLG with Dr. Matea Peter. We were invited early after we joined at St. Andrews to take over what was then known as the Center for Global Constitutionalism, the CGC, that had been founded by Professor Tony Lang of the School of IR, who is a leading world expert on global constitutionalism. And Professor Lang was moving on to new responsibilities, and he had asked if we might be interested in taking on the center, and it was a tremendous opportunity to be thinking about how to engage with scholars internationally and from the UK to bring them to St. Andrews, but also to help amplify the work that was going on here in the school and across the university. And after a couple of years, Dr. Peter and I sort of had the sense that the CGC was fantastic, but our expertise lay a little bit differently in global law and governance a bit more broadly. And so we just reformed the center along the same principles, but with a slightly different focus. And We then continued to run it for a few more years before it's been handed on to our colleagues who have done a fabulous job in expanding the CGC's work in the last few years. I'm really proud to be still a member and to see how the CGLG has grown. You might not be surprised that I can see quite a few, unfortunately. It feels like we're in a tremendously difficult moment. I think many would point to global climate change and the fact that while that's accelerating, we're actually seeing overall maybe a withdrawal of interest, or at least active support for that issue and contributions to that issue by major governments and therefore corporations. I think I'm personally very worried about democratic backsliding, the erosion of liberal democratic norms in a number of Western countries. In my own research area, though, what's been motivating a lot of my work is a sense that we have a tremendous opportunity from space technology and the uses of Earth orbit to enable tremendous benefits on Earth, but that actually we are in an inflection point with the rapid acceleration in the launching of satellites. The number of launches, the number of satellites being put in Earth orbit has grown dramatically and will continue to grow. That offers tremendous opportunity, but in my view presents a number of terrible challenges as well that we need to confront in terms of sustainability and safety, but also security challenges. The creation of debris, the interference that's coming from this larger number of satellites poses some serious governance challenges, and I think they're ones that actors are aware of, but we haven't really worked through yet in detail how to properly address them. There's a lot of initiatives underway at the UN and elsewhere, and with colleagues from the Outer Space Institute and other places, I'm happy to be contributing in a modest way to try to think through some of those challenges, but also possible ways of addressing them in the future. I started a lot of my research at a time, I think, that did feel more optimistic, at least in retrospect, and that the possibility of norm development, lawmaking to regulate armed violence in different ways was possible. There were these examples in the late 1990s and afterwards, even in the face of great power resistance, and that was intellectually interesting to me, but it also seemed like that this was the possibility of humanitarian progress, and I think there is still progress being made, but it does feel like we are in a moment of regression on some of those. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine from February 2022 really does, in my mind, mark something of a watershed in that regard, not only for the extreme violence that's been experienced in the war, but also the way in which other countries have interpreted the implications of that war. And so, for example, one that has concerned me a great deal in recent months is, even just in the last couple of weeks, the announcement by Baltic states, Finland and Poland, that they would initiate withdrawal from the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention on the idea that they need those weapons to guard against a future Russian invasion, or the prospect of a Russian invasion, to me is a really worrying sign of the erosion of some of these international norms. Now, it might be that in the fullness of time we see dedicated pushback from civil society and governments, and indeed that's happening with the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, trying to lead a concerted effort to reverse those policy announcements, but also to bolster the international treaty and norm against those prospective withdrawals. In the fullness of time, we might see that those efforts were successful. At the moment, though, it does feel that with landmines, with international criminal accountability, or the lack thereof, that we are witnessing a period of time in which international humanitarian law broadly seems to be less respected. We could think of other examples, whether that's in Gaza or elsewhere around the world, where there seems to be a mass use of armed violence in a way that isn't eliciting the kind of international condemnation and response that we might hope for. I am less optimistic than I used to be, perhaps. Maybe that's a function of age, but I also think that there's the possibility within these different norms and legal initiatives to see pushback from civil society in particular. Governments matter, but one of the things that my research is really focused on a lot is the agency and the possibility that comes from dedicated citizen movements. They were instrumental in establishing these norms and these treaties in the first place. They've been the guardians of them in the years since. So something I'm looking at in my own research outside the space context is the ways in which these civil society groups might seek to push back against these perceived erosions. Same is true in the space security sector, but it's an area where we have fewer norms constraining behavior in the first place. My hope is that even in these moments of really difficult geopolitical tension, there are the prospects or the possibilities of at least modest expansion of existing restraints, and that's something that I'm focusing on in my own research.